Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last quarter of our semester in Intro Psych. Last week we were talking before the test about clinical psychology, especially a number of psychological disorders. I'm going to talk about a couple more psychological disorders at the start of class today. And then for the remainder of the week, we're going to shift gears and talk about treatment. Because this is an Intro Psych course, I'm not going to talk about pharmacological forms of treatment, that is drugs that you can take for various psychological disorders. Not that it's not important, it is, but we have limited time, and I'm going to focus on psychological interventions, different kinds of therapy, for example. And for that reason, I think the chapter is 14. There's a section you can skip, or a few sections you can skip, 4.12 to 4.18, which focus on pharmacological interventions or treatments. You're welcome to read it if you're interested, but I'm not going to be talking much about it, and it won't be tested in this course. One other logistical note, this is week 11 of the semester, and just to remind you, if you're thinking of dropping a course, whether it's this one or any course, you have until this Friday to do so. After that, you are unable to drop a course. So just bear that in mind. If you've been thinking about dropping a course for one reason or another, this would be your last week to do so. I'm not encouraging you to drop my course. Just saying, it's been something you intended to do, sometimes the case, probably you should get on with it. Are there any other logistical kinds of questions before we dive in? Okay, we have a little bit of unfinished business. I want to talk about a couple more psychological disorders. There are many we could talk about. Don't have time to get into all of them in this course. If you're really interested in this side of psychology, we have a course called Abnormal Psychology, which is very popular. I recommend it, as well as various 300-level seminars, especially for psych majors. One more disorder I definitely want to talk a bit about is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental disorder. It's often profoundly debilitating. People suffering from schizophrenia, at least for periods of their life, have a great difficulty functioning in normal sort of day-to-day life. And this is in part because schizophrenia is associated with two broad classes or types of symptoms, and they're all very serious or significant. There's symptoms called positive symptoms. Positive symptoms are a sort of manifestation of strange patterns of thought and behavior. There's delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized speech. I'm going to talk a bit more in detail in a moment about what delusions and hallucinations are. Essentially, delusions are disordered patterns of thinking, ways of understanding or making sense of things, and hallucinations are disordered patterns of perception. The actual perception of the world, whether it's through sound or vision or even taste or smell, is affected, is disordered or abnormal. Schizophrenia patients also, as implied here, have disorganized speech that rambles, jumps from topic to topic, that doesn't really make sense necessarily to other people. These are all considered positive symptoms. The patient is showing these patterns of behavior. There's also a set of symptoms called negative symptoms, because it's almost like there's an absence of something. Flattened affect, an absence of emotion. So some people suffering from schizophrenia have trouble experiencing or expressing emotion. Reductions in speech. And a lack of initiative, apathy, great sort of loss of energy. These are all considered negative symptoms. And not every person diagnosed with schizophrenia exhibits all of these symptoms. They come in different sort of clusters for different people, but these are major sort of categories of symptoms associated with disorder. So I want to talk a little bit more about delusions and hallucinations. A delusion is a clearly false belief system, often bizarre, meaning very strange to anyone else, or grandiose, meaning, example of a grandiose belief system is what follows on the slide. A belief that I, for example, am God. That would be a grandiose belief about myself that's maintained in spite of evidence to the contrary and its irrationality. Critical part about it being a delusion is a clearly false belief system, right? So we talked a lot about conspiracy theories a few weeks ago, and lots of people believe in conspiracy theories. Generally speaking, conspiracy theories, unless they start to really affect someone's behavior, wouldn't be considered delusion, although they could cross into that territory. Common sorts of delusions for someone with schizophrenia are things like, I am God, or I'm godlike, I'm an angel or devil. Often also involve quite paranoid beliefs. I'm being followed by aliens or the CIA. What differentiates conspiracy theory from a delusion is often the sort of focus on the self. So I might believe that birds aren't real as a conspiracy theory, sort of a fact about the world. It is clearly false. It's a little bizarre. It's not really grandiose unless it's somehow about me. You know, the birds are all fake and they're all there to spy on me, right? This is the CIA targeting me. That starts to become quite delusional. And this obviously, or very likely, to affect my behavior, right? That kind of paranoid belief will trigger or result in paranoid behavior. It's a mystery in part as to why people suffer from these sorts of delusions, but one theory is that for people who have schizophrenia, their lives are really hard. This is hard to survive with or navigate with, right? Day to day. It feels like the world is falling apart. Things don't make any sense. And belief in these sorts of delusions may be an attempt to regain a sense of control. And this again is a bit similar to conspiracy theories. We talked about how people might believe conspiracy theories because they want to feel like the world is ordered or makes sense or has some control. This is maybe just sort of extreme form of that. So those are delusions. Those are about thought, belief. Hallucinations, which often go hand in hand with delusions, are false perceptual experiences that feel very compelling. They feel real, but there's no external stimulation. So someone might feel touch, but there's nothing touching it. Or might smell something, but there is no sense. Or see something that's not there, or hear something that isn't there as well. Hallucinations can involve any sense, but most commonly, schizophrenia in any case, they're auditory, meaning sound-based, and very often it involves hearing voices. And the voices are very often negative. That is, they're saying things like, you're a terrible person, you're awful, you're going to die. Right? These are not necessarily friendly voices. They can be, but they're often very negative, which is contributing, of course, to the difficulty of experiencing them. So delusions are about thought, hallucinations are about perception. Yeah. That's right. So that's a great question. So with OCD or indeed most anxiety disorders, if you question somebody, why do you think that, or do you think that's really true, or does that make sense? Often the client will say, no, I recognize that this is irrational. I recognize that it's irrational, like I'm so worried about my hands being contaminated. If it's a delusion, it's much harder to recognize it's irrational, because it's a sort of truly believed thing. And so if you were to ask a patient with these delusions, do you think this is irrational? They would probably say, no, I am God, or absolutely I'm being followed by the CIA. That's irrational. You're irrational because you don't believe it. So, great question. For these patients, it's much harder to see the irrationality. Yeah? There's certainly chemical contributors associated, at least in part, with the neurotransmitter dopamine. But like with depression and serotonin, that relationship is complex and it's not fully understood. There's a genetic component, so certainly people who have genetic relatives who suffer from schizophrenia are at greater risk, but just like with the other disorders, it's not entirely genetic. There's definitely environmental contributors as well. Collectively, those sets of symptoms, hallucinations and delusions, are known as psychosis. Psychosis distorts a person's perception of thoughts through hallucinations and delusions. So when someone's experiencing those two things together, they're experiencing psychosis. There are other disorders where you can have delusions and hallucinations. So sometimes someone suffering from mania, right, someone with bipolar disorder in a manic phase, can have a psychotic episode. That is a period of time when they have hallucinations and also have delusional kinds of thoughts. The experience of shifting into this phase is sometimes called a psychotic break, when somebody who hasn't had hallucinations and delusions suddenly starts to experience them. In schizophrenia, this is not uncommon, to occur in either someone's late teens or early 20s. Psychosis is the term, again, for hallucinations and delusions. And I want to highlight that that's not the same thing as psychopathy or psychopath, or being a psychopath. Although sometimes those two states, or these two things, are conflated in the media or movies or in conversation, they're not the same thing or even close to the same thing. Psychosis is the state of having hallucinations and delusions. The vast majority of patients with schizophrenia are not dangerous to other people. They don't pose a danger to anyone necessarily other than themselves. That's different than psychopathy, or in other words, a person who's a psychopath. Completely different thing. The formal diagnosis for someone who more colloquially we might call a psychopath is what's called antisocial personality disorder. There's a whole other category of disorders we're not going to really get into called personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder, avoidant personality disorder, but this is the one I'm going to talk about today, antisocial personality disorder. More colloquially, psychopathy, or someone who's diagnosed with this might be described as a psychopath. This is a very different thing. It has nothing to do with delusions or hallucinations. How would someone be diagnosed with this? Well, they'd have to exhibit a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, occurring since the age of 15, and indicated by 3 or more of the following. So things like failing to conform to social norms with respect to the law, deceitfulness, as indicated by repeated lying or conning others for personal profit or pleasure, impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, irritability and aggressiveness, it's indicated by physical fights or assaults, consistent irresponsibility, and I think very often a central feature, a lack of remorse, point number 7, as indicated by being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another person. Antisocial personality is a dangerous disorder. These people often do pose a danger to people other than themselves, in part because they don't seem to experience the sort of natural empathic responding that most people do when they see somebody else suffering. So somebody diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder might be willing to basically harm whoever it takes in order to get what they want. People with antisocial personality disorder probably won't surprise you are overrepresented in the prison population, right? So people, for example, in prison for murder have a higher than average response of being diagnosed with this disorder. One of the contributors to people committing violent crime. Okay. Yeah. According to this definition, theoretically, yes, but I think that's very unusual, at least as far as I know, but I'm not an expert on psychopaths. I do have a friend from graduate school who became an expert. He went to the University of New Mexico, where there's a big lab that studies psychopathic patients, almost all of whom, as I said, are in prison, usually for life, sometimes on death row. And he had some really sort of astonishing stories to tell about these people. They're often quite clever, and often very good at understanding how to manipulate other people. So he met one person early on when he started going to this prison to interview these patients or these people. And this guy had just arrived recently, and on his very first hour of arriving at this prison, he's in the prison yard, he stripped off all his clothing and just ran around in circles. And when my friend Matt asked him about this, said, "What is going on? What are you doing?" He said, "Oh, well, I'm in a new prison. I have to freak everyone out. Right? Like, I want to be the guy that they fear. So I'm just going to act completely, seemingly crazy on purpose so that they don't mess with me." Right? A very strategic kind of thought about influencing other people. He had another person he talked to who had was in jail for having murdered his mother. And the story, when he asked him about this, was told with zero remorse. So he murdered his mother because they were arguing about what show to watch on TV. And he ended up beating his mother to death with a beer bottle in this fight. And when asked about this, Matt was trying to probe him for some evidence of remorse. Like, what do you think about this now this has happened? Do you feel badly about it? And the person said, yeah, I do feel badly about it. And so that's, oh, okay, well, why? What do you feel bad about? Well, I feel bad because it ruined my life, right? Here I am in prison. That's what's terrible about it. He didn't feel badly that he'd killed his mother. Yeah?
Why did age check, like, if somebody not develop it later on in life?
It's very unusual, as I understand it, to develop it later in life. That typically speaking, this is a disorder that tends to manifest very early. If somebody was to start behaving this at like the age of 60 or something, it's very likely, as I understand anyway, it's probably not a personality disorder. It's probably caused by something biological like a brain tumor. And so if somebody suddenly, they've never behaved like this and suddenly they are, almost certainly doctors would be looking for evidence of some sort of neurological abnormality.
Is this directly correlated with maybe some past trauma? This is an example of get
Good question. Is it associated with past trauma? I'm not sure. I don't think it's a one-to-one thing. So it's certainly not the case that people who have suffered trauma in childhood, for example, are inevitably going to become psychopaths. In fact, this is a very rare disorder. And it seems like many people who do develop it have exhibited patterns like this from very young. They can't be diagnosed with the disorder until at least the age of 15. But people who ultimately do get diagnosed often have a pattern from young childhood of, for example, hurting small animals, torturing the family pet, things like that. That this pattern of behavior was often there from very, very early on. Yeah. Could be. I actually don't know the heritability rate off the top of my head. It's certainly got some heritability to it, but I don't think it's there's no disorders where it's sort of one-to-one. Okay. I'm going to wrap that up for now, our discussion of various disorders. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to talk about treatment. And we're going to talk about some specific forms of psychological treatment. We're going to talk about sort of what's called psychoanalytic therapy, which is Freudian, sort of what people often think psychology is about if they don't know anything about it. We'll talk about cognitive behavioral therapy and various other things. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about how do we know a therapy, a treatment, an intervention works? Psychology is a science, right? And so ultimately, what we do, especially for clinicians, and we're working with patients or clients, what we're trying to do is help them in ways that are empirically validated and scientifically demonstrated to be effective. The question is, how do we know? How do we know that something's been effective? And to some extent, this issue goes back to the very beginning of the course when we talked about research methods. And by the way, this question isn't just about psychotherapy. This is a question you have to ask for any form of treatment of any kind. So if you're looking, you developed a new medication to help people recover from the flu more quickly, or a diabetes medication, or something to treat hypertension. In every case, you'd want to know that this treatment, whether it's a pill, or a behavioral thing you have people do, or a mask they wear that go to bed, whatever, that it works, that it is effective. It's effective at helping them get better, or at least have reduced symptoms with regard to whatever challenge it is. So I'm going to pose a thought experiment and get you to think about it and talk to each other and then report back. So let's say you go to the doctor, you've been experiencing some strange aches and pains lately. Not sure what they are. The doctor takes a look, does a few sort of tests in the office, right, little things, prescribes a medication. Says, I think, you might be dealing with some sort of issue here. Here's a medication. So you take the medication for a week. A week later, you go back to the doctor. And when she asks you, are the pills working? You say yes. The question is, why? Why do you say yes? And what I'm going to suggest to you is there's more than one reason somebody might say yes. The most obvious one is that the pills worked. Right? So you had the problem, you had these strange pains, you took the pill, had this course of treatment for a week. When you go back, you don't have these aches and pains anymore because the pill itself caused those symptoms to go away. Cured whatever it was that was causing it. That's one explanation. What I'm interested in you thinking about is, why else? Why else might someone, having done exactly this, go back to the doctor and say yes? Yes.
The placebo effect of a figure of authority telling you that something will work, and your body just believing that it will work.
So the placebo effect, absolutely. So we're going to talk more about that. But the placebo effect, in this case, you're suggesting the doctor seems to have faith in it. When you go back, she says, are they gone? And so you say yes. And what I think you're implying is you're not just lying, right? You're not just trying to please the doctor, although that could be. But you actually do feel better, but not because of the pills, but because of something called the placebo. Oh yeah, yeah. Right, so the symptoms could be treated, or the cause could be treated. But if it's not about the pills doing either of those things, what could it be? Yeah.
I guess kind of going off what you're saying, let's say you went to the gym and you hurt something, and that's the aches and pains, then you take the pill. It's not, maybe not the pill that you work, it's just chronic.
Absolutely. So maybe it's not about the pill, that's just coincidental. Maybe, yeah, you had aches and pains because you'd worked out too hard, or something else, maybe you had a mild virus. And you naturally got better over the course of this week, and you think it's because of the pills, but it's not because of the pills, right? It's because, your body recovered from overworking during exercise, or whatever virus it called the aches and pains, cleared off on its own, and the pill is just a sort of coincidental. Totally. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right, absolutely. So yeah, maybe the aches and pains are caused by something like stress. It's a psychological thing. And then the act of taking something you think that will reduce stress actually makes you feel like, I feel less stressed. I've dealt with that problem. And that's the sort of natural recovery. Similar to a placebo effect, but maybe actually sort of directly intervening on stress is interesting. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah. Sure. So that could totally be it, right? The doctor, maybe someone you feel you need to please for some reason or another. They're an authority figure. Maybe they're a family friend. Maybe you just want to look good to doctors, right? Whatever. They're wearing a lab coat. So absolutely, patients do this all the time. Tell doctors what they think the doctor wants to hear. People often underreport symptoms they're embarrassed about because they don't want to say it in front of a doctor, right? In this case, the doctor's working to help you to feel better. You feel kind of badly that you're not as better as you hoped to be, but you say, yeah, I'm feeling good. So totally, that can absolutely be a reason as well. All of these are problems, right? If this doctor is really interested in, did it work, right? Like, did this intervention work? Are these useful pills for treating this condition, this presentation of symptoms? The fact that only one explanation has to do with the pills actually doing what you thought the pills are doing, what they're meant to do, suggests you have a problem. You can't really figure out very easily, is it the pills? Is it stress reduction? Is it a pure placebo effect, which we'll talk more about? Is it just a natural passage of time, like this person would have gotten better anyway? Is it that they're lying to me because they want to make me feel good about it, and they want to feel badly that I haven't helped? How would I know? So you really hit upon, I think, at least almost all the explanations I was going to talk about. As I said, one possibility is the pill really worked as prescribed. So this would be it's effective at doing what you want it to do. The second possibility, which you raised, was the pill didn't really do anything, but you still got better just simply due to natural causes, right? This would be your muscles are sore from exercising, they've recovered. You had a different kind of virus, you got better. The passage of time in and of itself could cause someone to have fewer symptoms, feel better, just as a function of that, nothing to do with the pill. A third one that we haven't quite talked about but will, is maybe you didn't actually improve what you think you did. And this would be a distortion of memory effect. So if we think about when we talked about memory, a lot of what we talked about was how our memories could be biased. We could think things about the past were not true. So maybe you haven't really improved, but you think you have because your memory for how you felt last week is worse than it actually was. And finally, there could be aspects of treatment other than the pills that caused you to actually improve. So this would sort of be like the stress reduction. The pills didn't really change the symptoms, but they made you feel less stressed, and the stress caused your muscles to unwind, and therefore you had less aches and pains. Or maybe just feeling like you took control of the situation. I took control of it. I went to see the doctor. I've been putting it off. I went, and simply doing that makes you feel a bit better. Again, it's not about the pill. So we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. Natural improvement. So many illnesses have a natural time course. In many cases, for many illnesses, both physical and mental, people do eventually get better with time, right? It's also the case that people often seek treatment when they're at their worst, right? So let's say you get the flu. And you know you have the flu, you feel really miserable, but you stay thinking ride it out. But now it's day 5, and you don't seem to be getting better. In fact, you think you feel worse today than you were yesterday, and it's weird. That's probably the time you seek treatment. But that's also, generally speaking, with the course of the flu, exactly when it's about to turn around anyway. And so you might get some treatment for it, but you feel better on day 6, but it's not necessarily because of treatment, because it was about to shift the trajectory anyway. This is also true for mental disorders. So we talked about depression. An average episode of major depression, as we learned about last week, lasts about 12 weeks. Once again, patients often seek treatment for major depression when they're really sort of feeling at their worst. And the natural time course of that disorder, actually, on average, people do start to feel better after about 12 weeks. Certainly not everybody. It's a variable thing. But on average, right, it does improve, at least for a while. Depression often has multiple episodes, so it doesn't mean someone's not going to have another one. But once again, there can be some sort of natural improvement, and so if someone's on a medication or receiving a certain kind of psychotherapy and they're getting better from depression, is it about the medication or the therapy, or is it about the natural time course of the disorder? Biased memory. There's something called change bias, which is a tendency we have often to perceive improvement if we're motivated to see ourselves as having improved. We want to believe it. Especially this is true if we've invested a lot in some sort of treatment. And often treatment is a lot of work, especially psychological forms of treatment. There's often homework, it's often pretty intense, it's often pretty uncomfortable or difficult. Having put yourself through it, people really often want to believe it worked, that they've seen some positive effect. There's a really famous experiment, not about therapy per se, actually about students learning study skills. So students, I can't remember what they were taking off the top of my head, but they were taking some sort of class, which was fairly difficult, and they were enrolled in a study skills course to try to improve their ability to perform in this course. Half of them are assigned, they're all assigned to take the study skills course, but half are put on a wait list, so they haven't taken it yet. The other half are in the course and actually go through a number of weeks of study skills training. At the end, the researchers measured these two groups' level of performance in the course, as well as their perceptions of how much they'd improved over the course of the semester. What they found was actually the study skills course had no effect on performance. It was actually completely ineffective. It did not work. The students who learned these skills did not do better than the students on the wait list. But there was a big difference between the two groups in how much they thought they'd improved. The students who who had taken the course thought they'd improved rather dramatically over the course of the semester. Those on the wait list believed that they hadn't. In reality, the course did nothing, but the people who had taken the course really thought that it did. And this is again a bit of a warning about how do you figure out whether something works. One way to try to figure that out would be maybe to interview these people after the fact, right? This is actually often the case. People are asked approached after something. How useful was this to you? This kind of evidence is often flawed for exactly this reason, right? Someone can't necessarily accurately tell you whether it worked or it didn't. All the people who learned the study skills felt like it worked, but in reality it had not worked. Same thing can be true for psychotherapy. You've done some intensive course of therapy. You want to believe it was effective because you invested a huge amount in it, but your beliefs about whether it was effective may not match the reality of whether or not it actually worked. And finally, there's this really big category of things called non-specific treatment effects. some of your ideas definitely were sort of in this category. Especially when it comes to psychological disorders. There's all sorts of things that can help people feel better. Simply having supportive interactions, right? With some disorders, patients or clients become very isolated, right? Think about some of those anxiety disorders. People stop interacting with friends and family. Simply having a supportive interaction that maybe you've lacked for some time in your life can help you feel better. And it's nothing about the treatment per se, it's just support of another person. Sometimes just deciding to do something about our problem can help turn it around, right? So I've been so anxious about this issue, I've been so worried, so afraid of spiders, perhaps. Simply deciding that I'm going to take this on, I'm going to try to stop being afraid, I'm going to get some help, might actually itself help to make you less afraid. Sometimes learning more about the problem. So there's an educational component often to getting treatment and learning a bit more about how it works. So it's not treatment per se, but learning a bit about how sometimes the thoughts lead to more depressive symptoms, or how anxiety drives maladaptive patterns of behavior and anxiety disorders. Just knowing that could be very helpful. It's not about the treatment, it's just some knowledge about the disorder itself. And finally, and this is where we're going to get to placebo effect, sometimes simply believing that you're getting treatment, having the expectation you will improve, causes real improvement. And placebo effects play out with sort of mental disorders, as we're talking about, but it also turns out they play out with physical symptoms as well, including feelings of pain and other kinds of things. So what is a placebo? A placebo, formally defined, is an inert substance or procedure that's received with the expectation it will have an effect. For example, the expectation might be that healing will be produced. So a classic placebo in an experiment, for example, drug efficacy, trying to figure out whether a new medication is effective, would be something like a sugar pill. So in a typical drug trial, placebo drug trial, you'd have two conditions. One group of patients who are receiving, say, your new drug for hypertension, and another group of patients who believe they are getting that new drug for hypertension, but they're not. They're getting a pill that's identical looking, so whatever the color is of the real pill, it's the same color. Whatever the size is, it's the same size. The bottle's the same, the label's the same, everything's the same, except it's not the medication. It's made of sugar. It's inert. It's not something that's going to affect their physiology. And only if you see a difference between those two things, between the placebo, that sugar pill, and the real medication, can you conclude the medication actually had a difference. Because it turns out that simply getting a sugar pill you believe is a real medication can also help you to start feeling better, can also potentially even reduce something like hypertension. Expectations, as it turns out, are really, really powerful. So I'm going to show you a video, hopefully this works, with a researcher called Daniel Ariely. I think he's now at MIT. It looks a little better than this, I think. Who's a real expert, among other things, on the power of expectations and has done a lot of research on placebo. I can't remember if he tells his own personal story in this video or not. If he doesn't, I'll tell it when it's done. But he's going to describe some really, I think, fascinating research that they've done on the power of expectation, which is really the power that underlies a placebo kind of phenomenon.
Sugar
So, at this point, I'm a mainstream psychologist, myself included. This theory of the mind is not really, what's the right word? This is not a very good theory of how the mind actually works. There is an unconscious mind, and we talked a little bit about it. There's lots of unconscious processing. But much of that unconscious processing isn't about like deep meaning, like things that happen in childhood or repressed memories. It's just about the dynamics of language production. So, for example, there's lots of research, including by a researcher here at Lehigh called Kato Shea in our psych department, who study language errors in production of speech. Right? And it turns out people make all kinds of errors for very simple production reasons, not about your childhood or your mother. But you might well say mother instead of another due to simply the mechanics of language production in the brain. So I'm teaching you about this form of therapy in part because it's important historically, but also because it's actually still widely practiced. There's lots of therapies to provide psychoanalysis. My father, a few years ago, went to a therapist and did psychoanalysis. And I was pretty skeptical, I have to say, as a psychologist myself. Said, why are you doing this? Why would you go to this person? For him, it was actually hugely helpful. But I suspect it was more helpful for the reasons we talked about, the therapeutic alliance, the rapport he developed with the person who he really came to trust, right? Those good conversations we had. But probably more about what was useful to him in this experience, rather than the interpretation of dreams or the other kind of techniques. Tell you about a couple more things. One's called free association. This is another technique. Free association often involves the patient, traditionally lying on a couch, and they just ask you to talk. Just talk, whatever pops in your mind. And over time, just let it flow. Everything that pops in your mind, say it out loud. This is hard to do at first, but once you start doing it, you get into a rhythm, and so those thoughts flow all over the place. And what the therapist is looking for is themes, and every once in a while, they see some sort of theme emerging, like you keep on bringing up this issue. Your brother comes up all the time, or this kind of anxiety, or whatever you're talking about, you come back and again to the same thing. The therapist will look for themes and then offer an interpretation. Say, you keep on talking about this. What do you think that means? Well, I think this was what it might mean. And what the therapist is often looking for in free association is not agreement from the patient, it's actually resistance. Because the theory, right, of repression is that repression is an active process of taking things from the conscious and forcing it into unconscious, like keeping it there. And it doesn't want to let it out. And so one sign the therapist is using is resistance. So whenever there's reluctance to fully engage with a theme or interpretation, they write it down in a little notebook and say, this is interesting. Whenever the person's mother comes up, they change the subject. I don't believe them when they say it doesn't matter. I think there's more to it than that. Right? It's a bit like detective work. So when the person doesn't want to talk about something, you suggest maybe they know something they don't want to tell you. Or maybe in this case, the conscious mind or the unconscious mind has something in there that it doesn't want to give up. And finally, I'll tell you about a phenomenon called transference. Transference is this idea that as an analyst, the therapist begins to assume a major role of significance in the patient's life, which they often do, right? It's a very important person. And in psychoanalysis, people often go multiple times a week for years. The client begins to understand at an unconscious level the therapist not as their therapist, but as some figure from the past, usually a parent. It could also be a lover. And they begin to react to the therapist based on those unconscious childhood roles or previous roles or fantasies. So here's a sort of diagram of that. Maybe this person had a parent from their past who always laughed at their feelings, right? Who made fun of them every time they expressed an emotion. Over time, the idea is that the patient, that's the me in the middle, begins to feel toward the therapist the way they felt toward their parental figure. And that all of those old memories they're not thinking about or they repress start to get put onto the therapist. And they begin to think, my therapist will laugh at my feelings. And then the therapist will say, well, why do you think I laugh at your feelings? I would never do that. And they think, well, maybe it has something to do about your past relationship that you've repressed. And so they use this transference as a tool to try to get at things from the past that the person can't remember. All right, we'll pick it up here again on Thursday.
We had the slide about the well-established treatments and the probably worked treatments. I saw the word psychodynamic. Is that just referring to like those different types of psychology fields?
Psychodynamic and psychoanalysis are often used interchangeably. So it's basically the same thing.